Ashes of Victory RK equals Part 1 RK equals CIC Republic Cruiser Victory. After Nan-3, Operation Star Hammer proceeded according to plan. At least my portion of it, and more or less anyway. Even that early, it was painfully clear that we would face many logistical challenges. That was because no one quite appreciated the amount of distributed infrastructure responsible for long-range travel that was simply gone by this point. On top of that, too many ships in my grand fleet were of different designs never meant for long-range operations and deployments. A lot of them were quite old, and while most of their systems had been usually religiously upgrades, the same wasn't true for the hyperdrives. That wasn't something you could always replace with a newer and better version without a substantial internal and external rebuild. To put it bluntly, my fleet consumed hypermatter like nobody's business. While the primary offenders were the supercapital ships, the bulk of the armada supplied by the SDFs in the core turned out to be a major headache for all my logistics people. They burned too much fuel. On top of that, too many of those vessels needed to refuel frequently, because they lacked large fuel tanks. While the escorts were the worst, several home-built capital ship types were no better. But yes, otherwise, my part of the operation was coming along splendidly. That was in no small part because after the fast one the CIS pulled off at Nan-3, going after my logistics vessels before we could drive them off with heavy casualties, no one offered resistance unless we actually went on the offensive. Our first stop after Nan-3 was a case in point. At Atarox, there was practically no military CIS presence when we got there. That made sense. The primary inhabited world in that system, called Atarox as well, was a literal scrap pile, run by crime syndicates. The same was true back in the time of my Sith Empire. It was very much the case these days too. The primary difference was that now there was one dominant syndicate trying to present itself as a legitimate enterprise and failing miserably. Beyond scrap, and the occasional archaeotech treasure you could find on an ancient ship buried under the endless trash heaps, the planet had one redeeming feature. The one claim to fame Atarox had was as a source for phosphine salts, a key ingredient in many painkillers. That would have turned the planet into a proper military target if the Confederacy wasn't using droid legions against us. As things stood, we wasted little time in the system, and I dispatched light forces to go after what little spaceborne industry and mining operations there were. That led to several skirmishes with what passed for local forces, squadrons of old fighters and lightships, which probably played the role of pirates when they could get away with it. After consolidating the fleet, minus a large super-capital ship-led detachment we left at Nan-3, we headed for Zalaris. That place had only one claim to fame. It stood as a waypoint on a hyperspace route. It was a colony of Fondor II, and even after thousands of years, it hadn't become fully independent, at least economically. The reason was simple. The bloody place was a barren wasteland, scarcely populated, and held no claim on any resources valuable to the rest of the galaxy. The bulk of the tariffs gathered by the locals went back to Fondor. They used those credits to buy themselves both protection and all the nice industrial goods they needed to live in relative comfort down there. According to the briefing I got on the place, the local government had jumped into the Confederacy's lap when a fleet turned on their doorstep. They lacked sufficient security forces to even slow it down, much less credibly oppose it. Notably, Zalaris lacked a proper planetary shield and SDF beyond a few light frigates. It had only an old theater shield covering the capital and the surrounding regions, making it open for invasion. As soon as we arrived in the system, the locals began screaming their unconditional surrender for anyone caring to give them the time of day. I left my restless admiral to deal with them as a distraction. This time around, there were no valuable targets in space to pursue. Nothing worth the fuel and munition expenditure. Just a few orbital farms and a handful of tiny mining operations that were of no consequence for the war at large. This place was the textbook example of a poor rim world, even if we were technically in the expansion region now. Mimbon was a place of interest. The swamp planet, not to mention the rest of the system, was mineral rich. Mimbon itself was the home of multiple indigenous intelligent species and the center of a long conflict between local and interstellar mining interests. Before the Separatists' grand offensive, there were factions on the ground supporting the Republic, while others threw their lot with the Confederacy, making for a nasty civil war. Notably, when Kenobi and company sent the orders for most of our forces to fall back to the core, elements of the 224th Clone Division volunteered to remain behind. The swamp warfare specialist attached to the unit, the Mud Jumpers, led the volunteers. No one heard a thing from them ever since the Sir Carpus system fell under firm Confederate control. When we arrived, we again found no trace of the Separatist Navy. Instead, there were a lot of trade vessels making a run for it and a light SDF detachment in orbit of Mimbon. When they saw us, the transports scattered, running either for the planet or hyperspace. Their actions provided a prime opportunity for our small craft to shine. Bomber strikes managed to account for a couple of dozen heavy-loaded transports filling their cargo all over the place. All that happened, while I merely observed the unfolding events. Truly, beyond the usual paperwork, being a fleet commander could be rather boring when the enemy refused battle. It wasn't like we could afford to chase the sis all over the place. That wasn't the goal of this particular exercise. A point of particular interest finally arose when the SDF fled to, and a Venator detachment entered orbit. After blasting the whole planet with high-powered transmission calling all surviving Republic forces on the ground, we got an answer which my advance force transmitted to my flagship. "This is Major Rin, RN 211 TK. I heard a weary voice. A few seconds later a distorted hologram appeared in front of me. "You're a sign for sore eyes, sir. The Separatist bastards have been screaming for anyone willing to hear the Republic was gone and demanding our surrender. They came close to knocking us out of the war. However, they failed. Major, at this time we lack sufficient ground forces to properly reinforce you. However, we can provide either a lift-off world or resupply and volunteers for reinforcements. Right now, I can't guarantee we will retain control of this sector for the foreseeable future. My mission is to primary raid and strike at critical targets, not to take and hold territory." I told him the truth. Operation Starhammer's primary goals were twofold. First, it was a raid to burn as much enemy industry as we can as fast as we can. Second, to force Trenk to pull back or find himself trapped between two large fleets. Holding this whole area for good might be a waste of naval assets better used elsewhere. "I see, General. We've held so far. We'll continue to do so. There are some good people down here we need to keep safe. If it isn't too much to ask, do you know the status of the 224th Clone Division, sir?" The Major didn't sound particularly pleased by the situation. However, he kept it to himself. At the end of this operation, most of the surviving SDF units would be heading home. Besides, I would need as many assets as I could get my hands on for the liberation of Mandalore. If the enemy continued to refuse battle, they might just have enough forces left in this region to retake it after our heavy combat elements left. Or perhaps not. My Quati counterpart leading the other prong of the assault was facing stiff resistance. She had to assault multiple systems where both the local SDF units and substantial CIS detachments held their ground backed by fixed defenses. On one hand, the fighting was a drain on logistics, not to mention the casualties suffered in crews and material. On the other hand, by the time she was done with the system, Admiral Sanchez left utter desolation in her wake as far as any war fighting and industrial infrastructure was concerned. As long as it wasn't protected by planetary shields anyway. Due to the heavy fighting, she was behind the original, perhaps overly optimistic schedule for Starhammer. However, the impact her actions would have on the war, in the long run, would be undeniable. By the time we were done here and might have to pull back, this whole region would be of little use for the Separatists without a substantial investment of resources. That, in turn, would make a future operation to take and hold it much easier. The obvious downside would be the need for substantial investment to secure the area if taken for good, but that was a problem for the future. The 224th is as well as it could be. They're slated to participate in the liberation of the Corellian system. Major Rin swore at that. They didn't lie about that? He exclaimed before catching himself. Sorry, sir. It has been hard being cut off and constantly bombarded with propaganda. It's all right, Major. I'll get the ball rolling on my side. You should be receiving a lot of supplies. While we have a task force in orbit, feel free to call down limited orbital strikes. I suggested. That was the most notable development in the system. We delivered enough supplies and weapons to the clones and our local allies so they could fight a high-intensity conflict for months. Orbital strikes wiped out several separatist-aligned bases on the ground even as we prepared to leave. Mimbon might just become the focal point for our future operations in the area, the Major claimed. A proper review of the reports he transmitted would be a better indication to figure out if he was right. That said, a notable point was that currently, Mimbon lacked an operational planetary shield generator. It had been heavily damaged before the 224th pulled back, and so far no one had repaired it yet. Thus our unrestricted ability to target enemy bases from orbit. Our next stop was Fabrin, the last point on the hyperlane before hitting Guindine. A report by Admiral Sanchez indicated she would need at a minimum another 48 hours before she could hit Ratha. Chanocent was a major separatist-aligned world, and the Confederacy had scrapped a large fleet to back up substantial SDF forces and many fixed defenses. Sanchez had to attack right in the teeth of those defenses and suffered significant losses, reducing the enemy naval presence. Chanocent itself was intact, though now ringed by hundreds of wrecked ships. Once again, the quasi-supercapital ships proved themselves invaluable in that kind of pitched battle. However, even they didn't come out intact. After replenishing losses and leaving behind garrisons, Sanchez would be down to 200 combat-effective vessels ready to deploy in offensive operations. That was a far cry from the 600 echelon contained at the start of Star Hammer. This wasn't the first time she had to replenish losses by cannibalizing the supporting elements of the 4th echelon either. Still, she was doing a great job so far, but I digress. Our next stop was of particular interest. For all intents and purposes, Fabrin was a corporate world closely aligned with the Trade Federation and Techno Union. In fact, for most intents and purposes, the Fabritech Corporation was attached to the hip with those entities. However, there was something else that made this place very interesting. One of Fabritech's directors, Kvan Mandel, wasn't happy with his corporation's alignment. He was currently on Coruscant, and I did meet him while we were all busy crafting the foundations of our new order based on Palpi's plans. Mandel was a fan of the general idea and would have been one of Palpi's allies in the region. He was now one of ours. I arrived with a large fleet and an offer for Fabritech's board of directors. Their location helped for what I had in mind. It was very close to Guindine, and that was one system we intended to hold come hell or high water. It was one of the gateways to the core and would provide us some defense in depth, if nothing else. Its proximity would allow Republic forces to quickly reinforce Fabrin if needed. That was why, as soon as we arrived in the system, I sent 2 pre-recorded messages to the locals. One was from Kvan Mandel. The other was my promise not to repeat Bothoi if they saw the light, so to speak. It was in proper diplomatic speak approved by both Satine and Padme, thus recording it back on Coruscant. It helped that the Confederacy didn't have a fleet here. As expected, they were consolidating their forces for a stand at Guindine, or so we believed. Speaking about the locals, they did have a large SDF, with ships bought both from various major Republic and Confederate yards. They had a few distinct local designs serving prominently in the fleet, primary escort vessels. No less than 6 Golan battle stations ringed the planet backed by hundreds of weapon platforms. To top it all, Fabrin had a modern planetary shield network too. The place was a tough nut to crack, one I would preferably avoid cracking and thus preserve as much of my fleet for future actions as possible. While the locals were deliberating, I had my fleet deploy in a defensive formation. That allowed my logistics vessels to refuel everyone in anticipation of battle either here or at Guindine. 3 hours later, we finally received a call agreeing to negotiate Fabrin's return into the fold. If this panned out, it might be one of the best things Operation Starhammer would achieve. Fabrin becoming a secure base of operations in the region would be a boon. Then there was all the industry in the system, which would work to our benefit if we reached a peaceful accord. RK equals. Part 2. RK equals. Lounge. Republic Cruiser Victory. Fabrin. When the locals finally gathered for the negotiations, I had retired to the lounge where I could do my part without any distractions. A crisp blue hologram came to life above the table I sat at. It displayed a number of men and women, most humans, sitting around a long table. A young man, late 20s at best, sat at its far end, looking at me with what was supposed to be unreadable expression. While his face was indeed blank, his tense shoulders and the thick tension surrounding everyone in front of me told me what I needed to know. Fabritec's directors and CEO were terrified, and it was obvious on more than a few faces. "It took you long enough." I spoke with a hint of displeasure, instead of following proper protocol and politely introducing myself. I was the stick in these negotiations. The messages from Coruscant I already sent when we arrived were the carrot. "You have the Chancellor's terms and the assurances of one of your own that they will be upheld. If you don't accept them, then Fabrin will be coming back into the fold on my terms." Now I smiled pleasantly. I have no use of people who gleefully supported the separatists since before this war began. At that point, I let my mask slide down a bit and stared at the assorted corporate worthies with glowing malevolent eyes. The dark side gleefully stirred around me, hungering for action. My smile grew a bit wider as I raised a hand and concentrated, using the hologram and the connection making it possible as a shortcut. It sounded easy, however this had been one of the hardest things to learn back in the day. Doing something like this required immense concentration, power and most importantly, a degree of mastery over the force that came with decades of experience. The table in front of the locals was made of thick strong wood and it was reinforced in places to better support built-in heavy secure terminals. I clenched my fist for a show, the force flowed through me and the heavy furniture shook under my telekinetic touch. For a moment everyone over there stood still, then they jumped around in fright when their nice massive table splintered. I allowed myself a moment to bask in the shock and pure, primal fear radiating from the beings in the hologram, before I took a stronger grip on myself. The dark side slid around me quivering with hungry anticipation and disappointment. "Serves the bitch right. Master, isn't this a bit excessive?" Aria pipped up in my head. "Under different circumstances, it would be, apprentice. You know very well what we learned when we returned to Coruscant. You know that not being prosecuted about your actions against the Confederacy as a war criminal was actually a victory, right?" I've heard such claims. I've also heard crowds both approving my actions and calling for my head. That much I conceded. We both know the truth, apprentice. You should know by now why I deliberately placed as many SDF units in positions where they would face Confederate forces without the benefit of my battle meditation. While we held our mental conversation, the assorted Fabritec directors came out of their stupor shouting. A few decided that discretion was the better part of valor and fled. Others, well, they stared at the table mumbling to themselves. The CEO? His mask was shattered, showing exactly how young and terrified he was. To his credit, he looked at the table then at my holographic form projected by a device on the ceiling. Beyond the terror, I could see understanding dawning on him. He was beginning to comprehend where we stood. "Are you sure you aren't merely digging up your, or should I say, our graves, because you're a stubborn old bastard?" Aria continued. "Many of our nominal allies would gleefully see us fight this war for them in order to keep them safe. However, when it comes to liberating Mandalore, or giving us all the tools and support necessary to actually win the war, well, you saw what happened. There are too many conflicting interests in the core, apprentice. In the safety of my own mind, I didn't bother hide my vexation and frustration. Even at the best of times, they're only roughly shuffling in the same direction. Now, when they believe themselves reasonably safe from the Confederacy, Many of our allies see each other as the greater threat in the long run. And we are even greater danger that needs to be handled. I felt Arya wince at my vitriol. If they can help it, there would be no fleet flying to liberate Mandalore itself and the whole sector for that matter. Many among our allies would love to see my people slaughtered and scattered, while my new home becomes a poisoned desert. Make no mistake, Arya, I'm not one of them. My power and my willingness to use it make me a threat. Was that why the Jedi chose to isolate themselves? My apprentice wondered. If I was feeling charitable, I might say that 1,000 years ago they saw what the Republic truly was. They and the Chancellor of the time tried their best to break the power of the core worlds. They failed. And if you weren't feeling charitable? Because I can clearly feel you most certainly aren't? I chuckled in my head. Then I would say that the Jedi of old foresaw that if they wanted to uphold their ideals, without the Sith around to distract them, they had a choice: either become something like the inefficient order we beheld, or walk a path that would inevitably place them on a collision course with the most powerful governments in the core. You're talking about a civil war with the Jedi being one side. Just like the one we're fighting right now. It was just that, it was a group of dark Jedi that sparked it. The parallels are there. The roots of this war run deep. If the Republic didn't radically restructure, it was only a matter of time. I trailed off. The remaining Fabritech directors finally gathered their wits and guts. I'm still waiting for an answer and I'm growing impatient. I spoke lightly, almost cheerfully. My eyes still glowed with the power of the dark side when I stared into the CEO. Ahem. We're ready to provisionally accept the generous terms sent by Chancellor Kenobi. The CEO didn't quite stammer. Good. I slowly pushed the dark side away and firmly put my mask back on. In practice that meant that my eyes ceased glowing and my face tuned a much healthier color. The smile I showed them next was almost genuine. Let's discuss the details. I can't believe that this worked. Arya spluttered in my head. Geonosis. Sullust. Bothoi. Every other separatist world subjected to orbital bombardment by forces under my command or influenced by my inimitable style. People know that I'm capable and willing to burn down whole worlds. While that does earn me many enemies, do not underestimate the power of existential threat, apprentice. Further, now everyone knows that officially, the Republic isn't willing or capable to rein me in. Or, they believe it anyway. No one wants to fight me anywhere near their home, and for a good reason. That only means that they would fight even harder to keep you away. To ensure that their homes and their loved ones won't fall into your hands. I know. That's why it's entirely possible the Confederacy won't face us in strength at our next stop. Gyndene was a loyal separatist world and the locals might not risk my wrath. Or they would fight that much harder to keep me away from the planet and their infrastructure. Ashes of Victory =RK equals Part 3 =RK equals Gyndene system. 2 scout divisions jumped out of light speed at the edge of the system. A single escort carrier flew at the back of their defensive formation. It began launching reconnaissance fighters as soon as it returned to normal space. As it turned out, the precautions were wasted this time. There was no enemy force in the vicinity waiting to ambush them, neither minefields nor automated weapon platforms spat death at them. On the contrary, as soon as their sensors could recover from the transition and begin gathering data, tactical computers noted a severe lack of signatures in range. The scouts dispersed, diving deeper within the system, and sent the signal for the second, larger wave to arrive. Soon, twice their number of light warships entered Gyndene and began their hunt, while the main fleet was still in hyperspace, moving much slower than it could have. Fighters carefully approached planets and moons, while deftly keeping away from the rings of fixed defenses surrounding Gyndene itself and the shipyards in orbit. Weapon satellites, minefields, and 2 very obvious modified Golan battle stations protected the planet. There would be fighter and bomber squadrons on the ready as well. However, there were no larger ships in sight. Neither the expected Confederacy fleet nor Gyndene's own system defense force was in sight. By the time the main fleet's vanguard arrived, the scouts were sure that no enemy battle groups were using celestial bodies for cover. There was still the option that the enemy was trying to be tricky and waited outside of the system, ready to attempt a hyperspace insertion to catch the fleet off guard. While the main fleet was still arriving and reforming its formation, the scouts accelerated for the edge of the system, and as soon as they were in good enough positions, they jumped in deep space, a few light years away from Gyndene, in search for ambushing forces. RK Lounge. Republic Cruiser Victory. The enemy continues to display glimmers of intelligence, I said aloud, as much to myself as to my apprentice. It would have been nice if they made a doomed last stand. Arya pipped up. I'm beginning to think that if they do make a stand, it's going to be above one of our worlds, thus rendering some of the threat I represent moot. I would have done the same. Arya snarked. You're learning from the best and don't have political considerations binding you. I pointed out. My compliments to the Admiral, Captain. I activated my comm. Have 5th, 8th, and 9th cruiser groups, and attached escorts, neutralize the shipyards. 11th and 15th are to sweep remaining space industry. Now, if I was the enemy commander facing someone like me and lacking powerful enough force adept to counter, what would I do? Avoid fighting altogether by running into deep space and then try to cut off supply lines was one feasible option. If I had to make a last stand, I would do it above an enemy world. That way, I would hopefully avoid the worst force sorcery I might face otherwise. And if I had to attack, I would prefer to face against a conventional opponent. My compliments to Admiral Sanchez. Inform her that she might be facing uninvited guests soon. She should be arriving at Ratha about now, shouldn't she? Arya asked. I glanced at the tactical display, then zoomed it out until it showed the relevant system. Ratha was an agri world, and while separatist aligned, we would want it intact in the long run. Fighting a pitched battle in that system would be less than ideal. Detach Task Force Gamma and have them ready to leave for Ratha at best speed if necessary, I ordered, and explained my reasoning both to my admiral and any other high-ranking officers listening. The rest of the fleet will proceed to the Antar hyperlane. Admiral Sanchez soon arrived at Ratha and reported only light enemy units, all noted escorting freighters to and from the agri world. She would neutralize or capture as many of them as possible and proceed to Gyndene at the best speed. So far, so good. This part of the operation was going too well, in fact, thus I waited for the other shoe to fall. We were halfway through the system, with cruiser groups busy blowing up industrial sites, when it happened. General, we've got a priority call from you from General Kenobi. A communication officer announced. Patch him through. Vale, we've got a spot of trouble over here. Obi-Wan scowled. Trench decided he didn't want to wait for us and counterattacked. This stunt I didn't see coming. I might have done so in Trench's position, but only because I would be able to leverage my battle meditation. Without it, the correlation of forces wasn't good. Even if Trench won after smashing through Kenobi's forces and the fixed defenses, he would be spent and would give me all kinds of delicious options. He threw several captured Corellian cruisers at us with escorts. While we managed to neutralize them, the damage is severe. Kenobi grimaced. He used them as cover to send boarding parties. There were more than enough of them to overwhelm the Guardian systems on multiple ships and either capture, destroy them from inside, or force us to do it ourselves. This includes Admiral Yularen's flagship. While he's alive, he won't be commanding anything for months. My mind raced over the implications. If Trench intended an all-out preemptive strike, he would have thrown everything he had at Kenobi. At a glance, this didn't make sense, unless it was a sacrificial gambit to buy time, but for what? He should have been able to outrun a pursuing force and get safely to Separatist space, leaving Kenobi to deal with any nasty surprises the enemy left us while they held parts of the core. He might be coming for me, and if that was the case, I would look forward to it. The numbers would be close enough. I would have an advantage in supercapital ships and battle meditation. Ever since the Separatists got their new leadership, and cleaned up house, they've been fighting smart. They had been husbanding their forces when they could and spending them freely when they believed they had a worthy objective. I had no reason to believe they would suddenly change this strategy. It was working for them, and it was a good idea considering the greater strategic situation. Trench was leaving the Corps. That was a given. The Confederacy had spent months fortifying the Karelian system. That was the place for a stand away from separatist space. It was the reason why I thought of Starhammer. We would avoid facing both heavy fixed defenses and a massive enemy fleet in one of our systems. Defeating them separately, with greater concentrations of forces, would be much cheaper. More importantly, he didn't want any close pursuit, which meant he had a target in mind. And there was only one target he could go after. The Mid-Rim Alliance. It was my turn to grimace. Trench is going after them. Neutralizing their remaining industrial capacity and detaching light forces to raise the remaining mining infrastructure in that part of the galaxy will prolong the war significantly. If we can keep them intact, and on our side, in 2 years there won't be a chance of a military defeat. In 4, we'll have the assets to overrun the separatists if our friends in the Corps are willing to pay the butcher's bill. If Trench takes them out, he'll be able to prolong the war significantly, and we can lose it off the battlefield. While those aren't the numbers I would use, I agree. I won't be in a position to pursue with enough force. I've already had scouts in the Karelian system. We'll need to clean up the orbitals and land heavy reinforcements all over the place. I'm afraid that would be the case with many important core worlds currently under separatist control. Kenobi explained. What he meant was that simply bypassing them and leaving them for later would be politically unacceptable for our allies. Antar was a separatist stronghold. I doubted we would face strong resistance there meant to slow us down. That left either Queller or Exodene. Both were loyalist worlds taken by the separatists during their grand offensive. It's a race, then. One we have to win. I'll need logistical support. I'll dispatch tenders under heavy escort, and I'll have Admiral Koenig strike towards Exodene at best possible speed. She'll have some logistic assets as well. May the Force serve you well, Obi-Wan. Kenobi twitched at the goodbye. May the Force be with you. He grumbled and cut off the connection. I took a moment to ensure my emotions were under control. I didn't risk everything, my life included, only to see the Mid-Rim Alliance annihilated before it could serve my purposes. The way politics shaped in the Corps, that alliance might be the one reliable sources of forces to relieve Mandalore. I had to preserve it. I chuckled at that. This was either a disaster in the making or a great opportunity to seize. =RK equals Part 4 =RK equals CNW Whisper in the Night CR-90 Corvette Hyperspace en route to the Karelian system. For the first time since the of Talus, Commander Solasta was coming home. She was no longer a lieutenant senior grade, but a full commander, and a member of the Karelian Free Navy. That was the auspicious name suggested by Senator, now General Graham Bell Iblis. The respected statesman was the factual commander and civilian leader of all honest Karelians who managed to flee during or immediately after the fall. Of those who lived and plied their trade all over the galaxy as a matter of course too. Iblis soon proved that for once a politician actually deserved their good reputation. He moved the heavens themselves and made deals with beasts from the deepest darkest Karelian hells to see their home liberated. Solasta didn't want to think what some of those deals entailed. After seeing the vaunted Republic fall apart months ago, the commander didn't particularly care. They had to liberate the Karelian systems, their families and homes first. They could get even later. It was finally happening, despite all the delays and nasty political games Solasta wasn't privy to as a simple commander. She didn't particularly care either. What was important was her current mission, one final scouting insertion, which would pave the way for the fleet's vanguard under Admiral Falconer. This was it. They were finally going to do it, and Solasta would be damned if they criffed up at the last moment. All green across the board. 30 seconds until real space transition. The fighters are still with us. We've got solid locks on the magnetic clamps. Celasta had never been a particularly religious person. However, this war brought her closer to her ancestors' faith than she believed possible. First, during the battle for Corellia, when endless numbers of separatist ships and swarms of droid fighters large enough to blot out Corel itself, threw themselves against the Corellian navy. As a junior lieutenant on board a cruiser, Celasta found herself praying then. She prayed for salvation when it became clear they couldn't hold the line no matter what. She felt overwhelming hope when Republic reinforcements arrived and plucked her out of the shot-up Celeste. And she cursed them to the deepest pit of the seventh hell when they retreated without firing a shot. Now, Celasta found herself praying again, for good fortune in the battles to come. For her family to be still alive. For what she feared they might find at Corellia when the separatists were cutting off their losses and pulling back instead of facing righteous retribution. Transition in 5, the helmsman's words brought her out of her reverie. 4, 3, 2, mark. The familiar vortex of hyperspace vanished when the corvette jumped out of lightspeed. Releasing fighters. Bringing up active sensors. Going evasive. Deflectors are up. No incoming fire. They had trained endlessly for this, even if Whisper's crew didn't have much opportunity to put those skills to a real test. Now they were back home. We're detecting faint anomalies. Tagging them as potential minefields. The sensors operator reported. Those are a lot of mines. Fresh too, or they would have drifted away from the area. We're detecting no capital ships in the immediate area. No small craft. Fighters away. Hunter 1-1 will scout the minefields. 2 and 3 will sweep by them, marking their flanks. The rest of the task force is transitioning now. Commander, there's no blanket jamming covering the system. Shall I try to contact anyone planet-side? Do so. Keep in mind that anyone answering might be either compromised or separatist plant. Be mindful of their codes as well. Celasta nodded in appreciation at the flawless execution and commendable initiative. She had one of the best crews in the Navy. She made sure of it through endless days and nights of training. There is localized jamming planet-side. Attempting to burn through or patch into distributed receivers, we've got a faint response. This is CN Whisper in the night, please respond. Endless moments passed while hardware and software shook hands and exchanged codes. This is General Hughes. A familiar gruff, and decidedly exhausted voice answered. The comms officer gave Celasta a thumbs up, showing that all the codes checked up. This sounded like the man in charge of Core Sec, it might even be him. This is Commander Belinda Celasta of the Whisper in the Night. It's good to hear from you, sir. We need actionable intelligence. Relief forces will be in system within the hour. That much she was authorized to say. The separatists knew they would be coming soon anyway. It's about time. The situation down here is critical. We need immediate reinforcements in the Coronet area. The city itself is cut off. The droids have a large number of our troops and civilians trapped and are grinding them down. All attempts to relieve them failed. I'm sending you all the up-to-date intelligence we have on enemy troop dispositions on Corellia. I'm afraid that we've got no contact with the rest of the 5 brothers for months now. Our best assessment is that organized military resistance there ceased a few months ago and any security service personnel who is left went underground. I'm relaying the data to General Kenobi. Sir, I'm compelled to ask about the political status of Corellia. Is it acceptable to deploy clone troops in the vicinity of the planet or even on the surface? While we're no longer in any position to contest the orbitals or any exclusion zones around Corellia itself, I can't permit the deployment of clone troops on the surface. They caused enough damage the last time. General Hughes stated coldly. For what's worth, I understand, sir. I'll apprise General Kenobi. =RK=, Briefing Room Alpha 2, Acclimator Assault Ship Remember Camino, en route to the Corellian system. A small cluster of familiar faces surrounded Ahsoka when she arrived for the briefing. Practically all of them were either junior officers promoted from the ranks she was barely new, instead of the small competent cadre she worked with on Coruscant. The reason was simple and painful: the GAR had a ravenous appetite for officers and NCOs even at the best of times. As things stood, Ahsoka had more experienced soldiers, NCOs and now Green officers than most of the new formations could boast. That led to a wave of cannibalization that pulled people with even a shred of experience to stiffen up and give edge to brand new formations just coming out of basic training. In theory, the lack of experienced leaders shouldn't have been such a large problem. There were countless people among the local SDFs with at least peacetime experience. Unfortunately, most of those weren't available. They were back home, training and expanding defense units which were unlikely to see any combat unless the Confederacy launched another major successful offensive in the core. What experienced volunteers the GAR could get, it already devoured. Ahsoka kept telling herself that she was luckier than most. She learned from the best, had the Force on her side as a power multiplier, and the Void Stalkers had some combat experience. They weren't beyond Green and had more training than the newest formation being currently raised might get. They were still a far cry from a proper equivalent clone formation, and that was going to be painful. What was worse, their colleagues were less capable, and that was going to suck. A few dozen holographic images came to life, everyone seated, and the briefing finally began. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm General Pascal Victis. A distinct Corellian accent accompanied the words. An old human man, with a short crop of silver hair crowning his mostly bald head, stood on the podium in front of the seats. The holo image made him look even older than he was in person. I have the honor of commanding the ground forces slatted to liberate Corellia. Everyone was supposed to know that. However, considering what an unholy mix of units from all over the Republic would participate in the coming operations, better be safe than sorry, Ahsoka guessed. I won't be feeding you bantha fodder. You're all aware that most of your formations are new, inexperienced and often untested. Ideally, we would have had many more months to train together before deploying in force. Unfortunately, the enemy does get a vote. We have our task and we will do our utmost to complete it. Ahsoka wondered how many of those enemies who got to vote were in fact supposedly on their side instead of openly fighting for the Separatist. No, bad Ahsoka. Such thinking, no matter how prudent, led to Sith-patented paranoia. In light of fresh intelligence, our first target will be Corellia itself. It is the one inhabited planet in the system where organized military resistance is still ongoing. We have actionable intelligence, which is partially confirmed by long-range observation. The general waved a hand and a map of Corellia replaced his image and hid the podium. This is Coronet City, which is our most immediate concern. The remnants of multiple core sec divisions are holed in the city, along with millions of civilians who couldn't evacuate before the Separatists cut them off. The enemy has been tightening the noose around Coronet, its defenders. They're about to be overrun, and if it happens, we'll lose a significant number of experienced soldiers we can use for future operations. Not to mention the civilians and whatever useful infrastructure is still intact. Green symbols designated the remnants of at least 10 different formations holed within rather small perimeter. There were many angry red symbols designating droid divisions of various kinds, including at least 3 heavy on armor and artillery. First, we need to reinforce Coronet with people and supplies so it can hold until we secure our primary landing sites and shatter the besieging forces. Considering the complexity of landing under fire in a contested city environment, I'm designating several of our more experienced formations for this exercise. First, Colonel Tano. Ahsoka perked up at that. She really should have seen this coming after her regiment's adventures on Coruscant. Your Void Stalkers will lead the way. I'm detaching 2 independent battalions of drop-qualified Anaxian Rangers to reinforce your regiment. You'll be in overall command as the most experienced commander. Further, I'll be adding the 37th Coruscant Assault Infantry Regiment and elements from 1st DERS Shock Division. The DERS have some of their new hover tanks configured for drop assaults. They'll provide you with an armored fist and come with attached mechanized infantry. We'll hold the city, sir. Ahsoka spoke at last. As long as the Navy can deliver us mostly intact, you'll have close fire support from numerous acclimators and multiple wings of Y-wing bombers. The fleet's whole small craft contingent will be available to provide air superiority and close air support. However, theater and tactical shields deployed by both sides will significantly diminish their utility. Now, the primary landing sites will have to secure fall under two classes. First, we'll deploy 2/3 of our forces in areas under Corps-Sec control. The general continued. Those were the least experienced formations, Ahsoka was sure. They will have time to deploy at peace. Second, we'll deploy our remaining forces in a pincer maneuver, forcing the enemy to contest attacks from multiple sides. All in the name of speed and political necessity. They had to liberate Corellia, then the other 4 planets in the system. After that, the rest of the Corps, and all the while, major fleet assets would be tied down supporting and protecting the ground forces.